What if the greatest construction feats on Earth were completed before written history began? Across Turkey, Peru, Malta, Indonesia, and Easter Island, stones weighing tens of tons were cut, moved, and locked together so precisely that modern engineers cannot fully explain them. Some chambers align with solstices. Some villages open through roofs instead of streets. Others sit buried beneath earth that may predate known civilization. Archaeologists argue over lost techniques, impossible logistics, and forgotten contacts. But no one answers the central question: how did these builders achieve what we cannot replicate today? And if the answers still lie beneath the stone, what else have we misunderstood? The short answer is that the word prehistoric itself may be the first mistake. It implies a time before history, which we treat as a time before complexity. Yet on nearly every inhabited continent, structures built before writing, before metal, and often before the wheel still stand in forms that confuse modern builders. The problem is not simply that they are old. It is that they preserve precision, scale, and intention that do not fit the story of human progress. And that mismatch is where the real investigation begins. Most people assume that early humans moved gradually from simple survival to complex civilization, but the archaeological record rarely follows that clean line. Instead, it shows early communities making sudden leaps, building structures that require organized labor, abstract design, and astronomical attention, often with no surviving explanation. In central Turkey, at a site called Atalhike, a dense settlement of several thousand people appeared more than 9,000 years ago, yet it had no streets. Homes were built wall to wall, and access came through openings in the roofs. The dead were buried beneath the floors, while walls carried paintings of animals, hunters, and geometric patterns. There is no palace, no central temple, and no obvious ruler. That absence is not a small detail. It undermines the idea that large coordinated construction requires kings and bureaucrats. Atalhike does not look like a city in the way later Mesopotamia does. It is not planned from a single center. It grows as a continuous built surface, rebuilt over centuries without abandoning the overall form. The reason that matters is simple. If dense permanent settlement could arise without centralized authority, then much of what we call civilization may have begun from repetition, ritual, and shared memory rather than from top-down command. That possibility makes the later monuments harder to explain, because once stone enters the picture, the evidence points in different directions at once. Archaeology inherited two contradictory instincts. The first treats ancient builders as surviving by brute force, dragging stones with ropes and manpower. The second treats them as mysterious, possessed of lost knowledge. For decades, the profession tried to sit between these positions, cataloging sites but avoiding extravagant claims. But certain structures resist that restraint. On the Peruvian coast and highlands, long before the Inca, societies built platforms, sunken courts, and carved galleries that required careful water control and aligned ritual space. These were not simple piles of rubble. At places like Chavan de Juntar, stone channels ran through underground galleries, likely to produce sound or movement of water during ceremonies. The builders had to plan voids inside solid mass, coordinate stone cutting, and manage the flow of water through enclosed passageways. That is engineering, even if it served ritual rather than industry. The situation sharpens when the stones become too large for easy explanation. In Ollantaytambo, high in the sacred valley of Peru, massive slabs were fitted into a terraced hillside. Some of the quarried stones appear to have traveled across the valley and up a slope. Mainstream archaeologists point to ramps, ropes, and large workforces, but no one has conclusively demonstrated the full transport system. The joints between some blocks are tight enough that a blade cannot pass between them. That precision would be impressive today, with metal tools and machinery. It is not impossible, but it is not fully understood. And Ollantaytambo is only one site among many. Now consider Malta. At Gontija on the island of Gozo, 2 temple complexes were built from limestone blocks, some weighing more than 50 tons. The temples date to roughly 600 years before the Common Era, older than the pyramids of Giza and older than Stonehenge. The builders had no known metal tools and no wheel, yet they moved and positioned stones into curving chambers that still hold together. At Tarxian, carved reliefs show spirals, animals, and architectural details, suggesting that the stone was not merely structural, but also symbolic. The effort invested in these monuments implies a powerful shared purpose, but no surviving text records what that purpose was or how the labor was organized. Before writing, memory itself had to be embedded in place. That is one reason stone mattered. A wooden structure can burn or rot. A stone chamber endures. In Scotland, a village called Skara Brae was built from local stone slabs, not only for walls but for furnishings, beds, shelves, and hearths were shaped into the buildings. The settlement was occupied around 5,000 years ago, and then abandoned, preserved by sand until a storm exposed it in the 19th century. Skara Brae suggests a level of domestic planning that many people once reserved for later civilizations. Yet the site is firmly Neolithic. It has no metal and no written record. The same is true for Newgrange in Ireland, a great circular mound built with white quartz and curbstones, engineered so that a narrow passage aligns with the rising sun at the winter solstice. For a few minutes each year, light enters the inner chamber, illuminating stone that remained in darkness the rest of the time. That alignment was not accidental. It required surveying, timing, and a model of the sun's movement across seasons. This is where the central tension becomes unavoidable. The first known examples of many building traditions appear not as experiments, but as completed systems. The problem is not whether ancient people could stack stones. They could. The issue is that the earliest recognized examples often do not look like first attempts. They appear as finished methods, already governed by mature rules of proportion, orientation, and technique. If a technique had taken centuries to develop, we would expect to find earlier, cruder versions. Sometimes we do, but often we do not. Either the earlier versions were made from materials that no longer survive, or they were built somewhere not yet excavated, or our model of gradual invention is incomplete. Each possibility creates its own difficult consequences. For much of the 20th century, archaeologists focused on typology, arranging pottery, tools, and building styles into evolutionary sequences. This method assumes that forms change slowly and predictably. But megalithic construction challenges that assumption because similar stone techniques appear across separated regions without clear contact. The prehistoric builders of Ireland, Malta, Peru, and Indonesia did not share a known written tradition or direct trade route, yet they all learned to select, shape, transport, and place heavy stones with care. The standard explanation is independent invention. Humans facing similar needs will find similar solutions. That is possible. But it does not explain the shared preference for solstitial alignment, internal chambers, and symbolic carving. Coincidence can account for the fact that people built with stone. It struggles to account for why they repeatedly chose to encode the same astronomical events in that stone. Early explorers often avoided that difficulty by crediting the monuments to outsiders. Greek visitors to Egypt, Roman visitors to Britain, and later European colonists each assumed that the descendants of local populations could not have built what they saw. The ruins were assigned to giants, vanished races, or foreign engineers. Those explanations were convenient, but they were also deeply misleading. They allowed modern observers to treat the sites as exceptions, rather than as evidence of long and complex local histories. Archaeology eventually corrected many of those claims. Local populations did build these structures. But the correction did not solve the engineering puzzle. It only moved the question to a harder place. How, without metal machines? Did the builders achieve results that modern engineers still debate? Consider the difference between a pile of stones and a fitted wall. A pile can be made by many hands without shared decisions. A fitted wall requires control over shape, angle, weight distribution, and sequence. At an Inca or pre-Inca site, a wall may contain blocks with many sides, each cut to match the neighboring stone. If one block is wrong, the joint fails. The process demands measurement and memory. Modern masons can do this with templates and steel tools, but they rarely need to because concrete and manufactured blocks are cheaper. This raises an uncomfortable point. Ancient builders may have invested in techniques that were not primitive but simply different, adapted to materials and labor rather than to speed. Their skill may have been lost not because it was inferior, but because later economies no longer needed it. That loss is not only technical, it is social. A technique survives only if enough people teach it, practice it, and need it. When the need disappears, the knowledge can vanish within a few generations. This is why later civilizations sometimes stood before older monuments and could not explain them. They were not stupid. They were separated from the labor systems that had made the structures possible. The same gap exists today. Engineers can calculate loads and stresses, but they do not always know how a community without writing coordinated hundreds of workers over years without the command structures of a modern state. The implications reach beyond archaeology. These sites are tests of what human cooperation can accomplish without fossil fuels or heavy machinery. They preserve evidence of societies that were organized around astronomical time, stone, and ritual. But they also show that complexity is not the same as technological superiority. A society can be highly organized and leave no written record. It can build precision walls without metal. It can create astronomical alignments without the decimal system. That does not make it supernatural. It makes it unfamiliar. And unfamiliarity is the real obstacle. The tools we use to understand the past are often shaped by modern assumptions about progress, states, and labor. When an ancient site does not conform, the reflex is to reach for exotic explanations. But the more productive question is different. What did the builders themselves need, fear, and remember? What kind of landscape did they see when they looked at the movement of the sun or the position of a river? The first chain of cause and effect is not mechanical. It is cultural. People began to build not because a ruler told them to, but because certain places and certain moments demanded permanence. That demand may have begun with the dead. In many early villages, burial beneath the floors kept ancestors inside the living space. Over time, the dead became tied to land and season. A chamber aligned with the winter solstice honored both the ancestor and the return of light. A stone set into the earth marked memory more permanently than any body could. If this is correct, then the great monuments are not separate from daily life. They are extensions of it, grown larger as communities grew more invested in continuity. But then the puzzle returns. If the earliest monumental forms were tied to something as universal as death and the sun, why do their construction techniques differ so dramatically from place to place? Why do some cultures abandon stone entirely, while others refine it for centuries? The answer may lie in local geology, but not only geology. A society builds with what it has. but it also builds according to what it believes. Stone is heavy, difficult, and lasting. Some cultures chose it precisely because it was difficult, because difficulty itself made the act meaningful. That possibility is hard to measure in an excavation, but it may explain why certain walls were cut with far more precision than function required. This is where the evidence becomes genuinely uncomfortable. At several early sites, the labor invested appears disproportionate to any practical need. A simple shelter can be made from wood, earth, or hide. Yet thousands of people moved stones that individual families could not have used. The only explanation that fits is collective intention, and collective intention at that scale requires a story, a shared belief that the work matters more than the cost. We can see the result of that belief. We cannot always hear the story. So the first movement of this investigation ends with a contradiction. The more we learn about early construction, the less we can treat it as a simple stage in human development. The sites are not failed attempts to reach modern engineering. They are complete systems in their own right. And they appear on the archaeological record not as a slow climb, but as a series of already formed solutions, sometimes separated by oceans and centuries, yet all pointing toward the same stubborn questions. Who decided to build? How did they convince others to follow? And why, after mastering such methods, did so many of those systems vanish? The answer may not lie only in the stones themselves. It may lie beneath them, in older layers that have not yet been excavated. In Indonesia, a hill called Gunung Padang remains the sharpest version of that problem. Is it a natural mound partially modified, or a buried structure built in stages over immense time? The question is not settled. But its presence marks the edge of the first lesson. The past is not a simple ladder, and some of its earliest steps may have been built downward into the earth. To understand why Gunung Padang matters, it is not enough to look at the terraces visible today. The site rises from a hilltop in West Java as a series of stone steps, overgrown with grass and trees, arranged on a steep slope above the surrounding fields. Local farmers had long treated it as a sacred place, but few outside the region knew its name until geologists and archaeologists began to examine what lay beneath the surface. The visible stones are columnar basalt, shaped naturally into long, straight pieces. That much is not disputed. The question is whether those stones were simply scattered by volcanic processes, or whether they were deliberately transported, stacked, and arranged over an older human-made core. In the early 2010s, a team led by Indonesian geologist Danny Hillman Natawidjaja reported something striking. Using ground-penetrating radar, resistivity surveys, and core drilling, they argued that Gunung Padang was not merely a surface terrace complex. They proposed that the hill concealed a sequence of buried layers, each older than the one above. The upper layers appeared to contain stone structures, but the deeper layers, according to their published claims, included cavities, chambers, and possible masonry at depths never excavated. Carbon dates from drilled material were interpreted by the team as evidence of human construction, beginning perhaps 20,000 years ago, with later phases around 9,000 and 4,000 years before the present. If correct, that would make the deepest layers older than any known pyramid or known agricultural city. The mainstream archaeological response was swift and skeptical. Many Indonesian archaeologists and international peers argued that the dates were misleading, that the drilled samples contained natural volcanic material, and that the supposed buried masonry was simply fractured basalt formed by geological processes. They pointed out that columnar basalt naturally breaks into pieces that can look deliberately shaped, and that a hill composed of such material would produce radar reflections that could easily be misread as rooms or walls. In their view, Gunung Padang was a late prehistoric terrace site built on a natural volcanic hill, perhaps no more than a few thousand years old, and the deeper claims were unsupported by excavation. That disagreement is not a minor academic squabble. It is a collision between two ways of reading the Earth. The geophysical evidence can suggest shapes and depths, but it cannot prove human intention. Only excavation can recover tool marks, charcoal, or constructed surfaces that separate human work from natural fracture. Yet excavation at Gunung Padang has been limited. The site became politically and culturally sensitive, with local authorities, national heritage agencies, and researchers disagreeing over whether digging would damage a sacred landscape or settle a scientific dispute. The result is that both interpretations remain active, each supported by different kinds of evidence, neither able to deliver a final demonstration. And that is precisely why the site exerts so much pressure on the larger story. If the early dates are wrong, then Gunung Padang belongs to the broader pattern of late prehistoric terraces, common across Java and Sumatra. But if even a fraction of the deep layers were human-shaped, the consequence is not simply an older date for one hill. It means that complex construction existed before the period, when agriculture supposedly allowed people to stay in one place long enough to build permanent monuments. It would force a revision not only of Indonesian prehistory, but of the global assumption that monumental architecture follows farming. That assumption has already been weakened by sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, where hunter-gatherers appear to have built stone enclosures more than 11,000 years ago. Gunung Padang would push the question even deeper, and that is why the resistance is so strong. The same pressure appears in a different form on Easter Island, at a ceremonial platform called Ahu Vinapu. The site is best known for a wall built of massive basalt blocks, fitted together with the same angular precision seen in the polygonal masonry of Peru. The joints are so tight that no mortar was used, and almost no gap remains. On an island separated by thousands of miles of open ocean from the South American coast, the resemblance is unnerving. Some researchers see it as evidence of pre-Columbian contact between Polynesian and Andean peoples. Others argue that the same need to fit irregular stone could have produced similar techniques independently. But the wall at Ahu Vinapu is not a rough survival structure. It is a deliberate display of skill, set into a platform used for ritual and ancestor commemoration. If the technique was independently invented, it means that identical engineering solutions arose in two isolated cultures with no apparent contact. If it was not independently invented, then the Pacific was crossed far earlier and more deliberately than standard history admits. Either conclusion would change how we understand ancient human movement. Great Zimbabwe raises a related but more painful question. In the late 19th century, European explorers and colonial officials saw the dry stone walls of the Zimbabwe plateau and refused to believe that African societies had built them. They proposed Phoenician, Arab, or biblical origins, despite the absence of any evidence. The walls, some reaching 11 meters high and built without mortar, enclosed large compounds and passageways used for elite residence, trade, and ritual. Excavations later recovered local pottery, iron tools, and gold, and radiocarbon dating confirmed that the builders were the ancestors of the Shona people. The stonework was not an import. It was an indigenous achievement, sustained over centuries of regional trade and political consolidation. Great Zimbabwe became a turning point because it forced archaeology to confront its own biases. The site was not mysterious because the evidence was absent. It was mysterious because earlier observers could not accept that African engineering belonged in the same category as European or Middle Eastern engineering. Once that bias was named, the technical achievements of other overlooked regions became harder to dismiss. The same colonial reflex had long shaped interpretations of Tucumay in Peru, where dozens of adobe pyramids stood on the coastal plain, and of Great Zimbabwe's massive stone enclosures. The reflex was to treat complex construction as a sign of foreign influence rather than local originality. That correction did not make the engineering easier to explain. It made it more demanding. If local societies across Africa, Peru, Indonesia, and the Pacific developed sophisticated construction on their own, then the number of independent innovations increases dramatically. And that raises the first major turning point of this investigation. The older model, in which civilization spread from a few centers and gradually taught the rest of the world to build, can no longer account for the evidence. Instead, the record suggests that multiple communities, separated by oceans and deserts, arrived at similar architectural solutions at different times, without a single source. That possibility is not a fringe claim. It is the uncomfortable implication of sites now accepted by mainstream archaeology. But the same implication also feeds the more speculative theories. If similar stone techniques arose independently, then why does the precision at Ollantaytambo resemble the precision at Ahu'vinapu so closely? And why do solstitial alignments appear at Newgrange, at Tecom, and at Maltese temples, with no shared language or recorded contact? The line between independent invention and lost connection begins to blur. Each new anomaly adds pressure to that line. And the first true breaking point came not from a wall, but from a site that was not built upward at all. Because somewhere in the highlands of Bolivia, carved into a single enormous rock outcrop, lies a formation that resembles a ceremonial map as much as a building. Its surface is covered with channels, niches, and geometric figures that do not fit any known local script. If the site means what some now suspect, then the earliest builders may have left their most important message not in stone blocks, but in the shape of the earth itself. And that message could rewrite the boundary between the human and the natural. If the carved rock in the Bolivian highlands were the only example of a landscape reshaped by geometry, it might be easier to set aside. But the complication repeats, and each repetition makes isolation harder to defend. On the island of Bali, the site known as Gunung Kawi presents a different face of the same problem. Along a steep river valley, 10 shrines are carved directly into a cliff, each one recessed into the stone as if rooms had been pulled out of solid rock. They are not built upward from blocks. They are cut downward into the cliff face, with facades that imitate wooden and that structures translated into stone. The scale is monumental, the carving precise, and the placement follows the course of the river and the shape of the valley, not a random quarry site. Mainstream dating places Gunung Kawi around the 11th century, associated with Balinese royal funerary traditions. Yet local memory speaks of older layers, and the site was probably sacred long before the visible carvings were made. The method of construction raises the same questions as Samaipata. Carving downward requires removing stone without error. A mistake cannot be replaced. Instead of adding material, the builders subtracted it, leaving only what belonged to the intended form. That is not an easier achievement. In some ways it is harder, because the entire structure must be imagined in negative before the first cut. The builders worked from a mental model of the finished space, and they executed it in reverse. This practice of subtractive architecture appears on multiple continents, often in places without direct contact. In Ethiopia, churches were carved from single blocks of volcanic stone. In India, temple complexes were cut into cliffs. In Bolivia, the channels and niches at Samaipata were ground into a single massive outcrop. The techniques differ, but the shared principle is striking, Instead of stacking stone, the builders reduced it. That choice is not forced by environment alone. It reflects a different relationship between the builder and the earth, one in which the rock was not raw material to be moved, but a sacred surface to be revealed. Now move to the Western Mediterranean, because the next complication is not about carving downward, but about enclosing space with stones far larger than any practical need. At Menga, near Antequera in southern Spain, a passage chamber was built from enormous slabs. Some of the capstones weigh around 180 tons. The chamber is not a rough shelter. It is a precisely oriented space, entered through a long passage, with walls that lean slightly inward and a roof formed by stone slabs placed across the top. The monument is among the oldest known megalithic structures in Iberia, dating to the 4th millennium before the Common Era, and it was built without metal tools. What makes Menga especially relevant now is not only the size of the stones, but their alignment. The chamber opens toward the northeast, and researchers have noted that its axis appears related to the summer solstice, though there is ongoing debate about the exact astronomical intention. The builders selected a site, arranged stones that weigh more than most modern cranes can lift, and oriented the whole structure to a solar event. If this were an isolated case, it might be called coincidence. But the same pattern appears at Newgrange, at Maltese temples, and at many Peruvian platforms. The sheer number of aligned stone structures forces a different conclusion. The next example comes from the Aegean. At Mycenae, in Greece, the so-called Treasury of Atreus is a Tholos tomb built around 1,300 years before the Common Era. Its inner chamber is formed by a corbelled dome of carefully cut stone, each course projecting inward until the structure meets at the top. The dome is not held by mortar. It stands by weight and geometry. The lintel stone above the entrance is estimated to weigh more than 120 tons. The builders had bronze tools, but they had no cranes, no steel cables, and no written construction manual that survives. Later Greeks looked at these walls and believed them to be the work of giants. That belief persisted for a reason. When later societies encountered stonework they could not explain, they invented a non-human builder. The same reflex appeared in Sardinia, where the so-called tombs of giants were built with massive upright slabs and a long central chamber. Their name already contains the explanation: giants. In reality, the tombs were collective burial monuments of the Neurologic civilization, built in the 2nd millennium before the Common Era. The largest stones stand several meters tall and are arranged in a curved facade that resembles a bull's horns, possibly a symbol of power or fertility. The orientation of many tombs toward the east suggests a solar or ancestral cult, but the name stuck because it was easier to imagine giants than to imagine a forgotten society capable of moving and setting such stones. These sites are usually studied in isolation. One specialist works on Iberian megaliths, another on Aegean tholoi, another on Sardinian tombs, another on Peruvian platforms. The result is that each discipline develops its own explanations, often without testing whether the patterns overlap. But when the sites are placed side by side, the similarities become harder to dismiss. In each case, enormous stones were transported from specific quarries, shaped with precision, arranged to enclose a chamber or define a space, and oriented toward the sky. In each case, the builders had no known crane, no written geometry, and no durable record of how the work was organized. In each case, later observers described the work as impossible, without giants or gods. The numbers are not subtle. At Menga, capstones approach 180 tons. At Mycenae, the lintel exceeds 120 tons. At Ollantaytambo, Individual stone blocks weigh up to 100 tons and were moved across a river valley and up a steep slope. At Sacsayhuam in Peru, which is outside this documentary but part of the same tradition, single blocks weigh over 120 tons. Modern mobile cranes can lift such weights, but they require steel, fuel, and paved roads. The largest ancient stones were moved without any of those things. Experimental archaeology has shown that a group of people can move a 10-ton block with ropes and rollers, but scaling that to 100 tons is not a simple matter of adding more people. The forces change, the ropes break, the ramps collapse, and the coordination becomes a major challenge. This is where the accepted interpretation begins to strain. It is not that mainstream archaeologists cannot imagine how it was done. It is that none of the proposed methods have been fully tested at the scale required. Ramps, sledges, ropes, and human labor are plausible in theory. But the remains show no trace of earthen ramps large enough to have moved the biggest stones. Some scholars argue that the ramps were later removed, which is possible. Others note that the ground around many sites would not support such constructions. The missing evidence is not fatal to the theory, but it is a gap, and every new discovery widens that gap. The gap becomes more serious when the architectural precision is considered. It is one thing to drag a huge stone into place. It is another to cut the stone so that its faces meet each other with almost no gap. At Mycenae, the Corbel dome required each course to be cut to a consistent angle. If the angle changed from one stone to the next, the dome would fail. At Ollantaytambo, the stones are shaped with many sides, each one matching the neighboring block. That kind of fitting is difficult even with modern templates. Without metal tools, the time required to shape a single block would have been enormous, and the number of workers would have required a food supply system that left no direct trace. So the compounding stakes are not about whether ancient people were capable. They were clearly capable, because the structures exist. The real tension is about the model of how societies develop. If each culture independently invented the same complex solutions, then the probability of convergence must be explained. If they did not invent them independently, then there must have been contact or a shared older source. Both options are uncomfortable. Contact across oceans before the known sailing technologies would require rewriting maritime history. A shared older source would require a common tradition that predates the separation of these populations, and no such tradition has been conclusively identified. Some researchers have tried to find a middle position. They argue that similar environmental pressures produce similar solutions, and that stone is the most durable available material. They point out that all human populations share the same basic cognitive abilities, so it is not surprising that they independently discovered the principle of the arch, the corbel, and the alignment to solstices. That position is reasonable, but it does not account for the specific recurrence of certain unconventional choices. Many cultures built with stone, but only a few used polygonal fitting rather than rectangular blocks. Many built chambers, but only some aligned them to the winter solstice rather than the equinox. Many carved rock, but only some chose to reproduce wooden architecture in stone. The pattern is too specific to be a mere byproduct of shared human nature. This is the moment when the accepted interpretation comes under maximum pressure. The evidence no longer fits a simple story of independent local developments, but it also does not fit a simple story of diffusion from one source. The truth lies somewhere in between, and that middle ground is harder to explain than either extreme. If the knowledge traveled, it traveled by routes we have not found. If it was carried by memory, the memory was maintained over thousands of years without writing. Either way, the models break, And that is precisely where the next recontextualizing event forces the question open, because among all these sites, there is one that does not merely challenge the boundary between human and natural, or between independent invention and shared knowledge. It challenges the boundary between what is a building and what is a map. It sits on a ridge in the Mediterranean, where stones are arranged not to enclose a room, but to mark positions in the landscape and the sky. And if the recent surveys of that site are correct, then the builders were not only engineers, they were recording an understanding of time that we have only recently reconstructed. That is the pivot, and it begins not with a wall, but with a circle. The circle is Avebury, and it does not behave like a building. Its outer ring of standing stones is more than 300 meters across, large enough to contain much of a modern village. Around it runs a chalk ditch and bank, dug so deep that even today the earth rises and falls around the monument like a frozen wave. Inside the outer ring are two smaller stone circles. When you walk through them, there is no single center. The space shifts from stone to stone, from path to path. That sensation is not an accident of ruin. It is the first clue. Avebury was not raised in a single generation. Construction began around 2,900 years before the Common Era, with phases continuing for centuries. The ditch alone required moving thousands of tons of chalk with antler picks and woven baskets. The stones came from nearby sarsen fields, dragged and set upright in pits cut into the chalk. Some stood more than 4 meters high. Archaeologists estimate the outer circle once held around 100 stones. Today, only a fraction remain standing, and many of the missing ones were broken up by later farmers and builders. But the scars in the earth are still there. For early antiquarians, Avebury was a Druid temple. John Aubrey and later William Stukeley walked the site in the 1700s and saw a ruined sacred landscape, complete with avenues of paired stones stretching outward. Stukeley drew one avenue running from the southern entrance toward another stone circle, and another running west. For a long time, later archaeologists treated some of these drawings as romantic exaggeration. The stones were gone. The avenues seemed too grand. But aerial photography and geophysics eventually proved Stukeley right. Buried stone sockets traced two avenues, now called West Kennet Avenue and Beckhampton Avenue, reaching across the ridges toward other monuments. That changes the unit of study. Avebury is not a stone circle surrounded by fields. It is one node in a connected complex. To the south, West Kennet Avenue led toward the sanctuary, a circular setting on Overton Hill. Beyond it rises Silbury Hill, an artificial chalk mound roughly 40 meters high with no burial chamber inside. It is among the largest prehistoric earthworks in Europe, and its purpose remains unresolved. Farther along the same ridge stands West Kennet Long Barrow, a stone chamber built for collective burial. To the northwest lies Windmill Hill, an older causewayed enclosure where people gathered and deposited remains long before the Great Circle was built. What connects these places is not random proximity. The avenues align along ridgelines and sightlines that may have been used for processions. Silbury Hill sits near the base of the Beckhampton Avenue, and from certain positions its massive conical form appears to close the western view. This arrangement suggests that the builders were not simply erecting separate monuments, they were organizing the land itself. Each stone, mound, and avenue functioned as part of a larger designed space, one that could only be understood by walking through it over time. Then, the astronomical evidence begins to sharpen the picture. Researchers studying the axes and stone positions at Avebury have noted possible links to the extreme northern and southern rising and setting points of the moon, not just the sun. The moon's standstill cycle repeats every 18.6 years. At the northern inner circle, several stone settings appear to mark that cycle's limits. If this interpretation is correct, Avebury was not merely aligned to the solstice. It encoded a longer and far harder observation, the slow rocking of the moon's path across the horizon over nearly 2 decades. That is the first part of the pivot. Tracking the lunar standstill requires observations sustained across generations. A single human lifetime is not enough to establish the full cycle with certainty. The builders had no writing that we can recognize. To preserve the pattern, they had to embed it in stone and in ritual memory. That means the monuments were not only ceremonial backdrops. They were instruments of knowledge storage, built to hold information about the sky in a form that could outlast individual observers. Each stone placement could serve as a marker, a piece of a repeating celestial map. Under this reading, sites like Newgrange, Menga, and the Maltese temples stop being isolated calendar jokes. They become fragments of a much wider tradition of landscape astronomy. The solstitial lightbox at Newgrange is not just an impressive trick. It is an event designed to confirm the return of the sun at the darkest point of the year. The orientation of Maltese temples toward the same solar turn points suggests that people kept careful track of the horizon. The fact that these traditions appear across separated regions may not require direct contact. It may require only that stable agricultural communities needed reliable calendars. But Avebury complicates that easy explanation because it adds the far more difficult lunar cycle. Why was the moon so important? One answer is that lunar phases provided a shorter, more visible clock for months and tides, while the slower standstill cycle connected the moon to the same extreme positions the sun occupied at solstices. At certain times, the full moon nearest the winter solstice rose exactly opposite the setting sun. For a society dependent on seasons, hunting, planting, and ritual feasts, predicting those motions would have carried real power. The people who controlled the calendar also controlled the timing of labor and ceremony. That is not a mystical claim. It is a direct consequence of keeping accurate records. But Avebury has a deeper complication. The stones were not only erected, many were later pushed into their own sockets and buried in the chalk. When Alexander Keeler excavated parts of the site in the 1930s, he found several stones packed into pits, sometimes with clay and chalk carefully laid around them. He re-erected many, but he also left evidence that the site had been deliberately dismantled at some point. Beneath one stone, human remains and pottery suggested that burial of the stones had been part of a ritual act, not just clearance. The same phenomenon appears at other megalithic sites, where stones were toppled, broken, or buried without conquest or catastrophe. This is the fallout that turns the pivot into a crisis. A knowledge system written into stone should have been maintained. Instead, at Avebury, parts of it were intentionally concealed. If the circle was a calendar, why would the keepers of the calendar pull its pages apart? One possibility is political change. A new religious order may have rejected the old stone markers and closed the avenues. Another is that the system had fulfilled its purpose and was meant to be sealed. But neither explanation is proven. What remains is the strange physical fact. Some of the very stones that encoded the moon's long cycle were placed face down in the earth, as if their meaning had become dangerous or obsolete. That is why the pivot increases the stakes. We are not looking at a simple rise and fall of a stone-building culture. We are looking at a moment when a sophisticated observational system was interrupted. The interruption did not happen everywhere at once. In some regions, stone building continued. In others, it was abandoned for wood and earth. At Great Zimbabwe, dry stone walls were still being built thousands of years later. At Gunung Kawi, Balinese carvers still cut directly into cliff faces in the 11th century. The timelines do not collapse into one era, but the knowledge systems behind them may have followed a similar pattern: long stability, then deliberate erasure. The immediate question is whether the erasure was caused by migration, environmental stress, or a shift in belief. At Avebury, the evidence allows no confident answer. Some stones were broken with fire and wedges, a technique used when destroying standing stones. Others were simply toppled into pits. The avenue stones were pulled down in long lines, but not all at once. The destruction may have taken place over generations, not in a single event. That slowness is important. It means the people who dismantled the monument were not outsiders arriving with immediate hostility. They were descendants, or near neighbors, unmaking the landscape their ancestors had built. That recognition forces a quiet shift in how we see all the earlier evidence. The builders of these structures were not a separate race with lost powers. They were ordinary human societies that developed specialized knowledge, held it for a time, and then lost or rejected it. The loss is real, but it is cultural rather than supernatural. A technique disappears when it is no longer taught. A calendar disappears when no one remains to observe it. A landscape system disintegrates when its markers are buried and its paths are forgotten. That is the real mechanism behind the first great mystery. But there is a further piece at Avebury that resists this neat conclusion. Inside the southern inner circle, early records and later geophysical work identified a smaller rectangular stone, setting around a now vanished central upright, known as the obelisk. The square did not align with the outer circle's apparent entrances. It seemed to belong to an earlier layer, perhaps built before the henge itself. Similar box-like settings have been found in other British prehistoric sites, and their orientation often differs from the later rings. That suggests the builders themselves were not continuous. They inherited older sacred geometry and chose to enclose it within newer monuments, as if preserving something they no longer fully understood. Now the earlier examples return with new force. At Samepata, carvings were layered over earlier carvings. At Chavan de Huntar, later builders expanded a temple around an older core. At Newgrange, the Great Mound may have been built over earlier structures no longer visible. This pattern of inheritance, reconstruction, and partial forgetting is itself a mechanism. It means the past was not simply erased. It was buried beneath newer meanings, sometimes literally. The stone circles and platforms we see today may be the final surfaces of much older sequences. If that is true, then the first revelation wave is not about a single lost technology. It is about a recurring human process, the invention of precise observational systems, their inscription into landscape, and their anxious or violent burial. The pivot is not from natural to human, or from simple to advanced. It is from a story of progress to a story of knowledge that can be built, stored, and then deliberately broken. That is a more disturbing and more useful frame for every site that follows. And it leaves a hard question hanging. At Avebury, the buried stones were found by modern archaeology, and many were re-erected. But re-erecting a stone is not the same as restoring a memory. The original relationships between stones, avenues, moonrises, and processions are only partially recoverable. Some connections are missing forever. So the instrument remains incomplete, its full design inferred but not proven. And if the instrument was incomplete at Avebury, then the same may be true for every other site examined so far. We may be reading fragments of an ancient code without knowing how many of its signs were removed or inverted. That is the immediate fallout. The major pivot does not reveal a secret technique. It reveals a hidden relationship between knowledge and erasure. And it forces the next question. If the builders were keeping a calendar and someone later buried it, what was the thing they wanted to hide? Was it simply the moon? Or was there something else encoded in the placement of stone and earth, something that only becomes visible when the sites are connected across continents rather than studied one by one? The answer may not be in Avebury at all. It may lie in a set of ruins far to the west, where adobe pyramids were built at a scale that still seems to contradict their desert environment, and where the next phase of this investigation will have to confront the possibility that the stones were not the only machines. The adobe pyramids at Tikio do not announce themselves the way fitted stone does. From the valley floor they look like worn brown hills, their edges softened by centuries of rain and wind. But they are not natural. They are among the largest earthen monuments in the Americas, and they were built layer by layer from millions of mud bricks. The largest platform, Huaca Larga, stretches roughly 700 meters across the flat terrain, making it one of the longest adobe structures ever raised. To build it required not just labor, but a continuous supply of water, clay, and fuel, all coordinated across one of the driest coastal environments on Earth. The scale is easy to miss because adobe erodes. A stone wall can survive for millennia with its corners relatively sharp. Mud brick begins to dissolve the moment it is exposed. At Tikumi, more than 24 major platform mounds rise around the massif known as Cerro Purgatorio, but many of their original surfaces are gone. The top platforms that once held elite residences, storage rooms, and ceremonial spaces have slumped into cracked clay. In places, buried staircases and wall fragments emerge only after heavy rains, as if the architecture is trying to return to raw earth. That fragility is the first consequence of the pivot. If stone monuments were designed to freeze knowledge across generations, adobe monuments preserve knowledge only under constant upkeep. Their survival depends on an unbroken chain of maintenance. Once the chain breaks, the structure does not simply fall. It begins to merge back into the landscape. At Tikume, that process started before Spanish conquest, during the shift from one ruling culture to the next. The Lambayeque builders were later absorbed by the Chim, and the Chim by the Inca. Each power altered the platforms, adding new surfaces over older ones. Some chambers were sealed, some entrances were closed. The succession was not simple destruction but layering, the same pattern of overwriting that appears at Shaven and Avebury. This layering makes excavation a trap. Remove the later surface, and the older one begins to decay. Uncover a painted frieze and it must be stabilized immediately, or it flakes away. At Huaca Las Balsas, one of the smaller Tikyam platforms, archaeologists uncovered relief panels showing marine birds and waves, imagery that may link the site to the Pacific and to myths about the sea as a source of power and creation. The panels had survived because later builders had covered them with new clay. The moment they were exposed, they became vulnerable. In this environment, discovery is also a form of destruction. That paradox changes the way the history is read. The builders did not choose mud because they were less advanced than the stoneworkers of the Andes highlands. They chose it because the coastal environment made earth the most efficient monumental material. Adobe could be produced in large quantities, shaped quickly, and added to existing platforms without quarrying distant stone. The resource was not scarce, the organization was. Making millions of bricks required knowledge of seasonal drying, soil mixing, and curing, as well as the ability to command or persuade thousands of workers over decades. The result was not a shortcut. It was a different engineering tradition, one that treated the building as alive and in need of constant renewal. That tradition carries its own symbolic logic. In Andean cosmovision, Mountains were powerful ancestors. Every source of water, every peak, every hollow in the earth had meaning. A platform mound may have been an artificial mountain, built to connect the people of the valley with the powers that controlled rain and rivers. The alignment of certain mounds with the Cerro Purgatorio Massif suggests the builders did not place them randomly. The valley's central hill became the axis around which the pyramids were arranged. What looks from above like an irregular scatter may be a planned ceremonial landscape whose full grammar is now lost. Modern archaeology arrived late to that possibility. For years, the coastal adobe sites were treated as less interesting than the stone highland monuments, in part because they were harder to preserve and easier to loot. The same colonial logic that denied African builders at Great Zimbabwe also dismissed adobe platforms as crude piles of mud. Yet Tukume contains many of the features that puzzle researchers at other sites: massive scale, repetitive platforms, possible astronomical or landscape alignments, and evidence of deliberate sealing and reconstruction. The material differs, but the organizational challenges remain. The institutional fallout began when the project led by the Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl in the late 1980s mapped the extent of Tikam. Heyerdahl was already famous for Pacific expeditions and for promoting the idea that ancient peoples could have crossed oceans. His presence at Tukam was controversial. Some archaeologists feared he would push diffusionist theories that assigned local achievements to outsiders. In practice, the project produced detailed surveys and excavations, drawing attention to the site's true size and to the urgent need for conservation. Local communities were hired and trained, and the pyramids became part of a broader effort to understand the Lambayeki sequence. But the attention also brought pressure. As the site opened to researchers and visitors, the unexcavated platforms became targets for looters who tunneled into the mounds looking for metal and ceramics. The Peruvian state faced the same problem that had already damaged many coastal sites: how to guard an enormous archaeological zone with limited resources. Rain and wind could do less damage than a single night of illegal digging, and because much of Tikam remained unrecorded, every looted hole removed information that could never be replaced. The loss was not just of objects, but of context, the exact relationships between walls, floors, offerings, and later fills. This tension exposed a deeper weakness in the accepted story of these monuments as pure expressions of community ritual. Tikam was not built by a classless society. The difference in scale between the platforms and the surrounding domestic areas suggests elite control over labor and ideology. The rulers who commissioned the platforms did not only serve the gods, they used ancestral cults to legitimize their own position. Every new surface raised above the old one was both an offering and a political statement. When the political system changed, the monument changed with it. That is not collective memory. That is institutional power. Now the countermove begins to form. At Piquillacta, high in the Andes near Cusco, a very different kind of power made its mark. There are no giant stones or adobe pyramids. Instead, the site is a vast grid of rectangular compounds enclosed by walls of stone and clay, spread across nearly 2 square kilometers. The plan is rigid, almost military. Long corridors divide blocks of rooms that repeat with little variation. Piquillacta is usually attributed to the Wari state, which expanded across much of the central Andes hundreds of years before the Inca. But for all its careful planning, the city does not seem to have been fully occupied. Many sectors lack the dense domestic refuse that would indicate long-term residence. Archaeologists have argued for decades over what this means. Some see Piquillacta as an administrative center, a node built to control a frontier region. Others suggest it may have been used only seasonally for festivals, ceremonies, or the gathering of tribute. A third possibility is that it was never finished. The settlement may have been abandoned during construction, when Wari Power collapsed or withdrew. In that reading, the grid is not evidence of a functioning city. It is evidence of an unrealized state project, imposed on a landscape that local people may never have fully accepted. The consequence of this discovery is difficult. It means that monumental construction is not always a sign of organic social development. Sometimes it is a sign of coercion, or of an elite trying to will a city into existence before the population and economy are ready. Pikkilahti does not fit the narrative of early builders freely cooperating to encode the sky. It shows another possibility, that states built empty frames to project power, and that those frames could fail. If such a site is later reoccupied and given new meaning, the original intention may be unrecoverable. That uncertainty has to be carried into every earlier example. Once that possibility is admitted, the earlier sites look different. At Atoll Hike, the absence of streets and central temples may not prove an absence of hierarchy. It may hide hierarchy in household ritual and ancestor control. At Avebury, the careful burial of stones may have been a political attack on an older order rather than a sacred closure. At Tecumseh, the successive overlays may record conquest as much as continuity. The pivot's promise of a lost astronomical system becomes tangled with the fact that many of these places were governed, expanded, and sometimes emptied by elites whose motives were not purely observational. That does not erase the knowledge embedded in them. It does mean the knowledge cannot be separated from the power that built them. There is a further cost. If the monumental record is shaped by both cooperation and coercion, then no single explanation will fit all sites. Some communities may have aligned stones to the moon because they needed to coordinate planting and ritual. Others may have built aligned platforms because rulers claimed to control the calendar. Both processes could produce similar forms. This ambiguity undermines the search for one lost technique or one hidden code. The real code may be multiple, and it may have been broken and remade by different groups for different purposes. That is the serious countermove now changing the direction of the conflict. It does not rescue the old colonial idea of simple diffusion. It rejects the equally simple idea of universal spiritual harmony. Instead, it forces a harder investigation. For each site, we must ask who benefited from the construction, who paid for it, and what happened when the beneficiaries lost power. At Tecumseh, the answer involves a sequence of ruling cultures adding to the same platforms. At Pikkilahti, it may involve a state that built an entire city and then never filled it with people. At both sites, the architecture becomes not just a record of skill, but a record of decisions made by someone on behalf of a system. With consequences we are only beginning to trace. The next movement will have to confront what those decisions left behind when the systems broke. Because Pikkilahti is not the only planned site that seems out of scale with its apparent population. In the northern part of Peru, a coastal complex called Cerro Sequen preserves stone carvings that may not be astronomical at all. They may be something more direct, records of violence, rendered in stone and placed at the entrance to a monument whose builders may have wanted the memory of blood to survive. If the stones at Avebury encoded the moon, and the mud at Tecumseh encoded ancestral power, then the carved panels at Cerro Sequen may encode a different kind of knowledge, one that later societies buried or defaced, not because it was sacred, but because it was dangerous. Cerro Sequen made the violence visible, because its carved stones were placed to be seen. But the countermove that began in the Americas was not simply resistance to outside researchers. It was the slow realization that similar patterns of expansion, inequality, and erasure appeared wherever monumental construction took hold. At Moundville, along the Black Warrior River in what is now Alabama, the Mississippian people did not build with stone. They moved earth. Over several centuries, beginning around the year 1050, they raised more than 24 flat-topped mounds around a central plaza. The largest platform rises toward the river, its base larger than many later European fortifications. The scale of Moundville is easy to underestimate because the mounds are now covered in grass. But each one represents thousands of basket loads of soil carried by hand up wooden scaffolds. The builders had no wheel, no draft animals, and no known written language. They still produced one of the most organized ceremonial centers in North America. What makes this relevant is not the dirt itself, but what it contained. Excavations in the mounds revealed burials with copper, shell, mica, and stone artifacts. Some high-status individuals were accompanied by other bodies, a sign that death and power were already entangled. The plaza and mound tops were not open to everyone. They were controlled spaces, built to separate elites from commoners. If Moundville proves that Earth can serve as a monument, then Casa Grande shows that the same kind of knowledge could be written into architecture in the desert. In southern Arizona, the Hohokam people constructed a large caliche-covered building, known today as Casa Grande, around the 14th century. It stood 4 stories high in a flat valley, near a river that the Hohokam channeled through hundreds of miles of irrigation canals. The building was not isolated. It sat within a walled compound, surrounded by smaller structures and fields. Openings in the upper walls have been interpreted by some researchers as aligned with the sun at solstices and equinoxes, and possibly with the moon at standstill. If those alignments were intentional, then the building was a calendar machine tied directly to the timing of water. The local O'odham people did not need archaeology to know the site was important. Their oral histories preserved stories of the building and of the ancestors who made it. But when Anglo-American settlers took control of the region, the ruins were treated as a curiosity. After the Gila River shifted and the community around the site collapsed, early preservation efforts stabilized the walls but also destroyed or buried many surrounding features. Stones and artifacts were carried off. The result is a standing structure surrounded by a landscape whose original meaning has been stripped away. That is the same pattern seen at Great Zimbabwe, where colonial looting removed evidence, and at Tikam, where illegal tunneling continues to tear information from the adobe. The wider consequence is not confined to one continent. At Poverty Point in northeastern Louisiana, a hunter-gatherer society built an enormous earthwork complex around 1,700 years before the Common Era. 6 concentric ridges and several large mounds form a geometric landscape at least 800 meters across. People moved millions of cubic meters of soil. They imported stone and minerals from distances of hundreds of kilometers. Yet they did not raise crops. They had no pottery in the earliest phases and no permanent domestic housing on the scale of later agricultural towns. The site was built by a mobile population that came together repeatedly for construction, ceremony, and exchange. That fact alone should have ended the old assumption that monumental architecture requires agriculture. But it did not. For decades, Poverty Point was treated as an exception. Then, Watson Brake, an even older mound complex in Louisiana, was dated to about 3,500 years before the Common Era. It too was built by hunter-gatherers. The combined implication is now inescapable. In at least 2 regions, the first known monuments appeared before farming. Göbekli Tepe made this point in Anatolia. Watson Brake and Poverty Point make it again in North America. If hunter-gatherers could organize massive construction, then the absence of agriculture cannot be used to dismiss the early dates proposed for other sites, including the buried layers at Gunung Padang. That is the first part of the situation becoming worse. The chronology is broader than the old models allowed. The second part is functional. At many of these places, the astronomical alignments were not separate from water control. They were part of the same system. The Hohokam used calendars to decide when to open and close canal gates. The Lambayeque builders at Takumi needed rainfall patterns to produce adobe on a massive scale. At Chavan de Juntar, water was channeled through stone galleries, perhaps to create sound, pressurize flow, or mark ceremonial events. At Pikilakta, water courses and drainage lines were planned into the rectangular compounds. The people who moved stone and earth were also moving water, and they timed both to the sky. The old label of ceremonial astronomy is too weak for this. It separates ritual from survival when the evidence suggests they were inseparable. A society that depends on seasonal floods or scarce rain cannot afford to treat the solstice as a pleasant symbol. It is a deadline. The monuments may have been calendars, but they were also public commitments to a schedule of planting, canal maintenance, and harvest. When the schedule failed, the monument lost its authority. That may explain why some sites were deliberately closed or buried, rather than simply abandoned. A stone or mound that no longer predicted the rain had become a dangerous failure, not a useful record. Then, the third and sharpest consequence arrives. The modern institutions responsible for explaining these places are themselves part of the erasure. At Moundville, early 20th century excavators removed large sections of mounds without preserving the relationships between layers. Human remains were taken, sometimes in ways that later Native American communities had to fight to correct. At Casa Grande, early repairs altered the original wall surfaces. At Great Zimbabwe, the colonial mining of ruins destroyed entire stratigraphic sequences. At Chavan de Juntar, looting and poorly recorded early digs complicated later work. In every case, the loss is not simply that objects disappeared, it is that the context, the exact position and association that gives an artifact meaning, was severed. That institutional damage is now central to the mystery. The debate over Gunung Padang became the clearest example. In 2023, a paper in an international archaeological journal argued that the hill beneath the visible terraces might contain a buried structure or layered construction dating to 27,000 years ago. The claim was based on core drilling, radiocarbon dates, and geophysical surveys. Media coverage exploded. The idea of a pyramid older than any known civilization spread across the internet. But within about a year, the journal retracted the paper, citing problems with the interpretation of the soil samples, and with the claim that the buried layers were human-made. The retraction was widely reported as a debunking. The actual result was more damaging than either side admitted. The retraction did not explain what the geophysical anomalies are. It did not settle whether the hill contains modified stone or natural volcanic fracture. It did not authorize new excavation. It only declared that the evidence presented so far was not sufficient to support the strongest claim. Mainstream archaeologists saw the retraction as proof that the early date theory was irresponsible. The original research team and its supporters saw it as suppression. Local communities and government agencies were left holding a site that was both nationally important and scientifically radioactive. This is the worst turn. The one place with a direct test of deep chronology is now effectively frozen by fear and politics. Established scholars avoid proposing new work because the reputational cost of being associated with pseudoscience is too high. Independent researchers face institutional barriers. Funding agencies hesitate to support excavation that could produce ambiguous results. All the while, the hill remains exposed to weather, farming, and tourist pressure. The longer the controversy persists, the less likely it becomes that the evidence will be recovered in a controlled way. But the worst turn is not only about Gunung Padang, it is about what the retraction revealed across the whole field. The standard response to an anomalous claim is not to resolve it, it is to reject it, often without replacing it with a better explanation. That may be scientifically cautious, but it also creates a gap. Unexplained evidence does not disappear because a paper is retracted. The stone walls at Ollantay Tambo still exist. The buried sockets at Avaberry still exist. The adobe platforms at Tikam still exist. No retraction makes them simpler. The refusal to engage with extreme interpretations leaves the public with only two choices: accept the orthodox account or accept the fringe account. There is almost no space for honest, unresolved uncertainty. That is the confrontation that now launches the final movement. The question is no longer whether the builders had lost techniques. It is whether modern archaeology has the institutional capacity to admit when a site does not fit its models. The payoff will not come from discovering a hidden chamber or a new inscription. It will come from forcing a different kind of accounting. What did these builders know? How did they preserve it? And why does the modern world keep losing the ability to read it? The first answer is already visible. The knowledge was not destroyed by time alone. It was sealed by decisions, by looting, by colonial classification, and now by public controversy. And once that becomes clear, the final sites in this investigation stop looking like isolated ruins. They begin to look like a single ruined conversation, interrupted again and again before anyone could finish speaking. The conversation did not restart after the ruins were exposed. It merely changed registers. What had been a series of separate discoveries across Turkey, Peru, Malta, Bolivia, Britain, and Zimbabwe now behaved like a single interrupted argument. The builders had been speaking through stone, earth, water, and sky, and each later generation had answered by rebuilding, sealing, looting, or forgetting. The final resolution is not a hidden chamber. It is the shape of that argument. Great Zimbabwe makes the point clearest because its modern history recapitulates the older loss. For centuries, local Shona communities knew the stone enclosures as the work of ancestors, a seat of power on the plateau. Then, European visitors in the late 19th century imposed a different story. They could not accept that African societies had organized the quarrying, transport, and dry stone construction visible in the great enclosures. They moved from one foreign explanation to another, from the Queen of Sheba to Phoenician traders. The site became an ideological weapon, drained of local meaning even as its stones were mined for gold and relics. The architecture did not change. The interpretative framework did. When Zimbabwe achieved independence, the country renamed itself after the ruins. Great Zimbabwe became a national symbol. The false colonial interpretations were dismantled and replaced by evidence-based African authorship. But by then, large sections of the site had already been stripped of the contextual material that would have allowed a full reconstruction. The loss was not reversible. That is the first consequence that now becomes unavoidable. Identification is not the same as recovery. A site can be politically reclaimed and still remain epistemically damaged. The same tension plays out at Newgrange. Today, the Great Mound rises above the Boyne Valley in Ireland, its white quartz facade glittering in modern photographs. That facade is not original. It is a reconstruction built in the 20th century based on an interpretation of the collapsed stone found at the entrance. The inner passage and chamber are ancient, and the winter solstice alignment is real. But the exterior is a later guess, made to complete a picture for visitors. Officials were aware that a reconstructed wall could mislead. It stabilized the mound and drew public attention, yet it also inserted a modern certainty where none existed. The lesson matters because many of these monuments are now presented as finished buildings. They are not. They are hypotheses in stone. That does not mean the builders were less capable. It means the surviving record is incomplete in a way that modern presentation often hides. The central promise of the hook can now be answered more precisely. Could modern engineers build these structures today? Yes, with steel, motors, and organized labor, many of the physical tasks could be replicated. What modern engineers could not easily reproduce is not the lifting of a stone. It is the entire social grammar that made the lifting meaningful. The long apprenticeship in stone cutting, the authority of the calendar keepers, the seasonal rhythm of quarrying and building, and the willingness of a population to invest years in a structure whose purpose was partly astronomical, partly ancestral, and partly political. Those systems cannot be recreated by issuing a contract. That is the honest answer to the question of whether the past can be rebuilt. The stones can. The society cannot. The confirmed evidence supports that conclusion. At Newgrange, the passage orientation is not a matter of speculation. On the winter solstice, if the sky is clear, sunlight enters the roof box and illuminates the chamber floor for a few minutes. At Skara Brae, the surviving stone rooms are not ruined shells. They include fitted beds, storage recesses, hearths, and drains. At Mycenae, the Corbild vault is not a natural feature. It is a load-bearing stone dome built with repeated courses, and it has stood for more than 3,000 years. At Gantesia, the temple chambers still carry colossal limestone blocks that were placed before the local society had metal tools. At Athol Haik, roof entrances and underfloor burials are visible in excavation. These are not ambiguous traces. They are large, structurally specific, and repeatedly documented. The less certain claims should be separated just as clearly. The lunar standstill interpretation at Avebury is plausible, but not proven. Some alignments are too weak to rule out chance. The astronomical rolls proposed for Takam and many coastal Andean platforms are still under investigation. The deep layers at Gunung Padang remain a matter of contention, not because the ground-penetrating radar was illegible, but because reflection does not prove construction. The distinction is not academic. It is the difference between what can be asserted as fact and what must remain open. When the site reports are stacked together, the physical methods begin to look less extraordinary than the organizational ones. Ramps, earthen counterweights, wooden levers, wet clay slipways, and human and animal traction can all be documented or reasonably inferred. No single lost force was required. What remains unexplained is how non-literate societies maintained dimensional consistency over decades, corrected errors without blueprints, and transmitted the knowledge of stone behavior across generations. In a modern project, the drawings, contracts, and inspection records carry that memory. In a prehistoric work, the memory had to be carried in bodies and rituals. It was slower, but it was real. That is why the independent invention of similar forms across separated regions is not as shocking as it first appears. A human body facing a stone block will discover certain stable solutions. Chocks, levers, smooth tracks, and careful sequencing are not arbitrary. They emerge from the material itself. The sun and moon are visible to everyone on Earth, so solstitial and lunar alignments would be discovered repeatedly by societies that watched the horizon. This convergence does not require a lost global civilization. It requires only prolonged observation and the decision to build permanent markers for what was seen. That is the strongest conventional explanation, and it covers most of the evidence. But not all of it. The tight polygonal joints at Olanti Tambo and Ahu Vinapu are not a necessary result of handling heavy stones. many cultures moved heavy stones without producing the same nested geometry. The presence of a nearly identical technique at two isolated locations is either a deeper convergence or a sign of contact whose root is not yet recognized. Both possibilities remain live. The safest position is that the evidence is insufficient. The strongest scientific position is to follow the evidence where it leads. The problem is that institutional funding and reputational risk now discourage that follow-up. That is the unresolved pressure at the center of the final movement. If the builders of these places were not superhuman, then their eventual failure is not mysterious. Environmental change, political fragmentation, disease, and shifting trade routes can all explain particular abandonments. But the pattern of deliberate closure is harder to explain by climate alone. At a number of sites, the final act was not flight, it was sealing. Stones were buried in pits, passageways were blocked, ritual spaces were closed with care. At the fortress temple in the Negev, the sanctuary was intentionally shut rather than destroyed. At Gontija, the exact sequence is less clear, but the temples gradually passed out of use, while memory of them remained strong enough to generate later myths of giants. At Newgrange, the entrance was eventually sealed. At Skara Brae, the village was abandoned so completely that sand buried it whole, without obvious signs of massacre or fire. The inference is not that one catastrophe struck everywhere. It is that different communities, for different reasons, decided to close their stone archives. That decision is the most important unresolved detail. It suggests that the monuments were not simply outdated tools, they were reservoirs of authority. A new political or religious order often cannot leave the old reservoir intact, because anyone who controls it controls the calendar, the ancestors, and the public memory. So the new order buries it. The burial is not vandalism. It is an attempt to transfer power. In many cases, it succeeded. The oral memory of the old alignment slipped away within a few generations, and the site became a place of legend. That is not an engineering failure. It is a cultural rupture. The modern era repeated the rupture under different names. At Poverty Point, agricultural machinery and later development nearly erased the ridges before the first detailed mapping was done. At Moundville, early excavation practices, however well-intentioned by the standards of their day, moved enormous volumes of soil without preserving every relationship between mound layers and the artifacts inside. At Tecum, looters' trenches still cut through platforms that have never been properly surveyed. At Great Zimbabwe, early treasure seekers removed archaeological deposits before a single controlled stratigraphy was recorded. The public may imagine the main risk to these places is time. The actual risk is often access and neglect. This is the hard consequence that Part 10 began to move toward. The idea of an erased past is not only ancient, it is contemporary. Every looting episode, every poorly planned restoration, every retracted claim that freezes further research adds another layer of loss. The original builders preserved information in stone, because stone lasts. The modern world, for all its equipment, has not always preserved the information contained in that stone. In some cases, it has destroyed more information in a century than the previous 1,000 years did. That is why the final resolution must be stated in negative rather than positive terms. The greatest achievement of these builders was not any single technique. It was the ability to make knowledge public and durable without writing. The greatest failure of the present is not that the techniques are lost. It is that the interpretative context is still being lost, even now, under the pressure of tourism, nationalism, institutional rivalry, and the demand for clean narratives. The builders deserve more than mystery. They deserve careful reconstruction where the evidence allows it, and admitted uncertainty where it does not. There is one last surprising detail that changes the broader interpretation. The most domestic of the sites, Skara Brae, contained a network of covered stone drains connecting from the interiors of the houses to external channels. Some of the structures may have been used for the removal of waste. This was not a ceremonial feature. It was civic infrastructure, built into a village of roughly 8 stone houses around 5,000 years ago. The same culture that aligned monuments to the solstice was also managing sanitation inside the home. The two facts are not contradictory. They are complementary. They show that these societies did not divide the sacred from the practical. They engineered the house and the passage tomb with the same attention to water, direction, and permanence. That final detail undermines the image of the prehistoric builder as a priest-king obsessed only with the sky. It shows a builder who thought about drainage, warmth, storage, and cleanliness. The great stone chambers were not separate from daily life. They were extensions of the same logic: control water, mark time, shelter the living, and honor the dead. The mystery is not that these people were fundamentally different from us. It is that they created durable systems without the forms of record-keeping we assume are necessary. That is the real surprise, and it leaves the last section of the investigation with a quieter but more radical question. If so much of their knowledge was embedded in everyday arrangements, then how many other ordinary structures have been lost simply because they did not look monumental enough to protect? That is the handoff to the final reflection. The story does not end with a hidden vault. It ends with the recognition that the most important ancient technology was not a tool. It was a way of tying memory to place so tightly that even after the people were gone, the place continued to speak. Some of that speech is now confirmed. Some of it is guessed. Some of it has been drowned out by later voices, including our own. And one last site, a natural mountain shaped like a pyramid at a place called El Cono, will make the point vivid because it is the rare case where no human hand may have been involved at all. If such a formation can be mistaken for architecture, then the boundary we have been tracing between nature and intention may be the most fragile line of all. If a natural mountain can be mistaken for architecture, then the error still tells the truth. El Cono rises as a near-symmetrical pyramid, but its form was not cut by human hands. It is a geological accident. The very fact that it appears designed is the last piece of evidence in this investigation. Human beings do not only build patterns, they also see patterns where none were built, and for thousands of years, they have chosen to treat certain shapes as meaningful, whether the shape came from erosion or from effort. That distinction is not an admission that the earlier sites are illusions. It is the opposite. At Ollantay Tambo, the joints were measured. At Skara Brae, the drains were excavated. At Mycenae, the vault still stands. The evidence separates human modification from natural fracture. El Cono matters because it marks the edge case, the point where shape alone is not enough to prove intention, and that is exactly where the hard work of archaeology begins. The builders themselves did not always respect the same boundary. They chose locations that already carried visual or spiritual weight. A rock outcrop, a river bend, a hill against the sky, these were not blank sites. They were presences. At Samai Pata, the largest carvings were made directly into a reddish sandstone outcrop that already dominated the eastern slope. At Avebury, the henge and avenues were laid across ridges that shaped movement and sightlines long before the first stone was raised. At Chavan de Huntar, the temple rose where 2 rivers meet, and water was brought inside through stone-lined channels, as if the mountain itself were being made to speak. That pattern changes the meaning of construction. The builders were not simply placing objects on the land, they were negotiating with forms that seemed already significant. In many traditions, the landscape was not inert matter. It was alive, ancestral, or charged with power. To build was to enter a relationship with those forces, not to dominate them. A pyramid of stone or earth could imitate a mountain. A passage oriented to the solstice could tie the human community to the same cycle that governed snowmelt, flood, and harvest. The distinction between natural and artificial was not absent, but it was less important than the relationship between sky, water, and memory. This is one reason why modern engineering cannot fully restage these achievements. A contractor can lift a stone. What cannot be recreated by contract is the slow, inherited conversation between a community and a particular place. The knowledge was carried in apprenticeships, in seasonal work parties, in rituals that marked the beginning and end of construction. It was not written in manuals, it was written into bodies and into the sequence of the work itself. When the community that carried that knowledge scattered or changed its beliefs, the manual disappeared. That is a cultural loss, not a magical one. The loss repeated across unrelated regions, because the conditions for preserving that knowledge were similar everywhere. A new ruling group often had reasons to close the older monuments. The old calendar might still command loyalty. The old ancestors might still be invoked against new political arrangements. So stones were buried, passages were blocked, or the narrative was changed. Time and sediment finished the work. After a few generations, the place could be recast as the product of giants or vanished races. The original builders were not defeated. They were overwritten. Modern institutions have inherited that pattern, often without meaning to. When a site becomes a national park or a monument, the state decides what is visible and what is left underground. That decision is not neutral. It can freeze research, amplify certain interpretations, or press the ruins into the service of a modern identity. At Great Zimbabwe, the official rejection of colonial myths was necessary, but the site had already been physically damaged by treasure seekers and early excavators. The political correction could not recover the lost stratigraphy. In that sense, every modern act of protection is also an act of selection. Some questions are preserved, others are quietly closed. The physical destruction continues as well. Looters tunnel into unexcavated mounds at Tikiom. Erosion eats at exposed adobe surfaces. Early reconstructions, however well-intentioned, may have altered original alignments or hidden them beneath new stone. The public sees a restored facade and assumes certainty. Researchers see a composite of original and modern design and know the difference. The result is a gap between what these places look like and what they actually tell us. That gap is part of the unresolved tension the documentary has been circling. The monuments are not simply remote mysteries. They are active sites of contemporary debate, and the debate changes the evidence. Yet there is also continuity. The winter solstice light still enters Newgrange for a few minutes each December. The sun still rises over the axis of the temple at Gantia in Malta. The water still moves through the old channels at Chavan de Huntar when the weather is right. At Skara Brae, the stone beds still face the hearth, and the drains still trace the lines the builders set 5,000 years ago. The physical arrangements survived because they were made to last. What remains missing is the layer of meaning, the names, songs, and instructions that once surrounded them. Those cannot be re-erected like a fallen stone. The local communities around many of these sites have often been the most effective guardians, not because they possess all the archaeological details, but because they possess the moral continuity that the ruins were meant to serve. At Moundville, the descendants of the mound builders have recovered a voice in how the site is interpreted. At Great Zimbabwe, the name itself carries political memory. At Casa Grande, O'odham oral history preserves connections that early surveyors ignored. These living traditions do not answer every engineering question, but they remind us that the sites were never empty of meaning, even when the original builders were gone. It is also worth stating plainly what this documentary has not found. It has not found a hidden device, an anti-gravity method, or a secret race. Those stories are unnecessary. The actual achievements are extraordinary enough. The challenge is to hold two ideas at once. The builders were entirely human, and their abilities still exceed our current explanations in certain specific cases. That tension is not a failure of science. It is the normal condition of studying deep time. That is the largest import of the final reflection. The question is not whether these builders possessed a lost technology that modern people cannot understand. They did not. They possessed a technology of memory, tied to place and community, that is fragile by nature. Modern people can understand it. But understanding requires accepting uncertainty, respecting local knowledge, and resisting the urge to force every site into a clean, evolutionary story. When the evidence does not fit, the honest answer is not to invent a lost civilization or to dismiss the anomaly. The honest answer is to say that the model is incomplete. If there is one thing the last hour has shown, it is that the past is not a ladder from simple to complex. It is a series of socially organized experiments, some of which succeeded for thousands of years, and then failed. They failed not because the builders were primitive, but because every knowledge system depends on people who are willing and able to carry it forward. When those people are gone, the system can become illegible in a single lifetime. The stones outlast the memory. That is the deeper reason these sites still fascinate. They are proof that durability and understanding are not the same thing. One hill in Indonesia remains the sharpest symbol of that choice. The evidence beneath it could clarify the chronology of monumental construction in Southeast Asia, but the public controversy has made careful excavation nearly impossible. As a result, the site is neither confirmed nor fully rejected. It sits in a kind of interpretative limbo, and that limbo is spreading. Other projects face the same pressure. Researchers who ask difficult questions about early dates or apparent cultural contact may find it easier to remain silent than to risk their reputations. That silence is not scientific caution. It is a modern version of the ancient act of sealing a sanctuary. The final unresolved question is not about any one ruin. It is about how modern societies choose to handle their own incomplete records. Do we protect the ambiguity, or do we plaster over it with signs, reconstructions, and confident conclusions? Do we support research that asks slow, expensive questions, or do we only fund excavation when the result is likely to draw cameras? The answer will determine how much of the remaining evidence survives the next century. The original builders did their part by anchoring memory in stone. The next move is ours. If this kind of investigation matters to you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Every ancient wall, every buried chamber, and every carved rock is a message from people who could not speak to us directly. The least we can do is listen carefully before the message disappears. The next discovery is already under the surface, and as long as someone is still willing to look, the conversation between the past and the present has not ended.